As we continue looking at a handful of the parables of Jesus in this summer season, this morning we are confronted yet again by another incredibly famous parable that even if you are not regular in the halls of the church, there's a good chance you've heard of this parable before. It's called the parable of the Prodigal Son. And it's a story of a family with some level of sibling rivalry, you might say. Now, my family is just getting back from spending a week with my whole extended family at Ocean City in a house, and I am glad to report no sibling rivalry after 1 week. But you can be just with your sisters, your brothers, or whoever you grew up in, and doesn't it just always bring back some of the memories of some of the injustices you feel like you might have suffered as a child? And so I can find myself relating to a whole lot of characters in this story. And I'm curious this morning if that might not also be true for you. Let's take a look together. Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11, we will read all the way down then to the end of the chapter. As Jesus continued, that's important, right? Because these are really three parables that go together about lost sheep, lost coin, and now a lost son, as it were. And so, grateful for Dean and his excellent teaching last week on those first two parables, really together, the lost sheep, but also the idea of the lost coin. And this will really just carry on in that same vein. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'll set out, go back to my father, and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a ways off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, he threw his arms around him, and he gave him a kiss. The son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven, I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast. Let's celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost, but now he's found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry, and he refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and he's alive again. He was lost, and he is found. The Word of God for the people of God. So what on earth is going on in this story? Well, at some level, it's kind of obvious. So bear with me as I state the obvious here in the beginning of the parable. You have a younger son who makes a bold and radical decision, does he not? And it's important for us to stop and analyze this decision and attempt to understand where it comes from and why it happened. So I kind of just want to ask a couple of leading questions about the younger son and attempt to sort of gain some answers around it before we kind of move deeper into the parable. So the first is, why? Why would the younger son make the decision that he makes in this moment? And you remember, the decision that he makes is to ask his father for his inheritance, and then to take everything he has, to leave for a foreign country, and to just kind of spend it wildly. Why would he do this? Well, I don't think we're being judgmental when we say the reason that he does this is because he's arrogant, right? He's arrogant and what I would call entitled. In other words, he's saying, give me what is rightfully mine. I want it now. But he's not only arrogant and entitled, he's also selfish and prideful, is he not? Not only do I want what I say is rightfully mine, but I don't care how it affects anyone else. I'm going to do with it what I want. Now, I think in 2024 we can read this parable and see the boldness and the radical nature of it, but probably not to the extent that the people hearing it in the first century world of Jesus would have understood it. Because what this man is doing, no one would ever think of doing. In essence, he is saying to his father, you're as good as dead to me. I'd rather you be dead so I can have what is mine after your death than to be alive. Now, how would you respond to that as a father? And oh, by the way, I don't just want my stuff from you. I want to break free from you completely so I can go live however I want without this family culture hanging over my head that's going to dictate somehow how I ought to live. If you've assessed this about the younger son, you're exactly right. He is arrogant and entitled. He's selfish and prideful. Those are the presenting problems here. And so what happens to him then? Where does he end up? Well, it's again somewhat obvious, isn't it? He spends wildly, and it goes quick. Isn't it true that we always have less than we think that we have? What we think might last for this long tends to last a little bit shorter, does it not? And especially when you're spending radically. Now, we're not told in this story, but the context kind of leads us to assume that the father was somewhat wealthy and that this man got a decent hunk of money from the father selling off some of his estate, no doubt, in order to make good on this inheritance. So he spends it wildly, he's left with nothing, and he ends up in a foreign country. Now again, we have to understand this in the first century world of Jesus. For us, for you maybe, the first thing you would do if you got a great inheritance would be go visit a foreign country, right? Take a lavish trip, go somewhere exciting, or maybe even move somewhere exciting. But what's happening here as Jesus is telling the story is he's showing a separation not just from the family, but from the whole people of God. Does it make sense? Because when this son is moving to a foreign country, he's not just rejecting his father, he's rejecting the covenant that God has made with his people, which is all about the land where they dwell together. You can go off on journeys, but you don't go live somewhere else. And so then it should not surprise us, because all through the Old Testament, whenever someone makes a rash decision like that, it never ends up good for that person, does it? When I think about the opening chapters of Ruth, where Elimelech goes off to find bread outside of the house of bread, And it does not end up good for him or his sons, does it? And so this man runs out of everything. Famine comes upon it. He finds himself helplessly in need, and he gets a job. Right? Now, on our family vacation, extended family vacation, I was talking to my nephew, David, and he's got this new job he's pretty excited about. He works at the Puma outlet in outside of Lancaster. And he was telling me, my head was ringing when he said it, he got hired as an entry level, and he's making $15 an hour. Good for him, right? But of course, in my older brother's self, as we'll get to in a second, I reminisced my first job at 16 and how many dollars an hour I pulled in. And I could count them on one hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. $4 an hour way back in the early 90s. And he worked 15 hours in a week and pulled in $200. I worked 15 hours in a week and pulled in $60, right? And so I was feeling bad for myself. But this guy gets hired to work with pigs. Now, perhaps you love farms and barns and wild animals, and the idea of working with pigs for you would be a luxurious dream job. And you're going to have to convince me to believe that that's true. I mean, I guess a pig could be cute from a distance. My guess is when you are up close and personal with these animals, it is not exactly a beautiful experience. They are filthy animals. But Jesus doesn't pick pigs because they're overweight and omnivores and are down in the mud and digging ruts and all of those things. He picks them because they are decidedly ritually unclean for Jewish people in the first century world. And so what has happened here is this man has distanced himself from his loving father, has walked away from the people of God, and has now found himself at the height of ritual uncleanliness. Does this make sense? So much so that this man finds himself wishing he could be the pig instead of taking care of the pig. Think about this for just a minute. And the story tells us at that moment, he comes to his senses. Or more literally in the original language, he comes back to himself. There's an essence of he remembers who he actually is. So third and final question, why does the man decide to come back to his father? It's all about identity. He remembers who he is. He has a realization, an understanding, a reconnection to the truth about who his father actually is and what it means to be part of that family. Now, kids, if you're 16, 17, 18, maybe if you're 5, 6, 7, I don't know, you're always constantly thinking about what it means to live under the tyranny of your parents, right? And how harsh and horrible they are because they don't let you do wildly radical things. But there comes a time in your life, I should pause and say, some of you have possibly grown up in difficult situations, and I don't mean to make light of that. But for many, there will come a time in your life where you will realize, oh, that actually was a good place for me to be. And God actually was protecting and caring for me in that place. And this is the kind of realization that the younger brother is having in this moment. He's remembering, wait a minute, even the servants who worked for my father had tons to eat. How much more his sons? He's remembering the truth of the culture in which he grew up. And as he remembers, as he's faced with the truth of his situation and the truth of who his father actually is, he has to get honest with the truth about what he's actually done, doesn't he? And he says, quite boldly and significantly, I have sinned against heaven and against my father. This is a theologically correct way to think about our rebellion, our missteps, our sin, whatever you want to call it. That is, that it is first always against God, but then is always also directed towards our fellow brothers and sisters in some way. And this man has this realization that this is what he's done. And it leads him to the ultimate realization that I don't deserve to be called my Father's son anymore. And as harsh as what I'm about to say might seem to you, I plead for you to listen to me, especially in the first century world of Jesus. Everything he says is absolutely correct. He does not deserve to be called his Father's son anymore. And his Father has every right to disown him and be done with him. After all, this is the very thing the Son has requested. But he sets his heart back towards his Father, and he makes the long journey back towards him. And now as we turn to the Father, we're faced with a bold and stark picture of utter grace, aren't we? Because this boy is coming back fully aware of the gravity of what he has done. And at some level, ready to pay the consequence for it. To get hired as a servant in his father's house. At some level, even asking that is asking for some grace and mercy. Is it not? But what is the posture of the Father? The first thing that Jesus tells us is the Father sees him while he is still far off. The Greek word makros, right? Macro. He's a ways away. It's like looking through a telescope to see him. So there are implications to this statement, no? The first is, he didn't just happen to see him. He was looking for him. And he wasn't just looking for him from the bedroom window where every once in a while he pulled the curtain back and saw what he could see. He was patrolling the borders of his property and looking far into the distance. My guess is even going beyond his property to look far out for his son. And it was not just coincidence that he happened to be hoping to get a glimpse of his son, fully desirous of his return. I just need to be honest with you, friends. As much as I love my boys, and as much as I would hope I would have a posture like this, if one of them took the posture they had, now you're laughing because you said, if they asked for your inheritance, Adam, it would not be a lot. And you're correct in assuming that. Nevertheless, if they said to me, you're as good as dead to me, I don't want you to have any place in my life ever again. Give me what's mine, we're done. I'm not sure. I'd be patrolling the edges of the fields. And yet here he is. And then he catches a glimpse of the Son. And you can almost picture it in your mind what it looks like, can't you? Because Jesus says he looks on him with compassion. The picture is almost as if his eyes light up, while at the same time seeing the utter destruction that has happened to his son. He looks on him with compassion, oh, by the way, not condemnation. And if that's not good enough for you, he looks on him with compassion, not righteous vindication either. You know what I mean by that, right? It's not just condemnation, say, sorry, you had your chance. But it's also not, see, I told you so. It's come back. And he runs to him. I don't know how old the guy is in this story, but my guess is, running was a thing he did years ago. And yet here he is, tearing through the fields. hopping fences, brushing aside people, doing everything he can to get to his son as quickly as possible. And when he gets to him, he throws his arms around him and he kisses him. A holistic embrace. Now, the father doesn't necessarily know where the son has been, but we do. And so what Jesus is also implying in this story is that the father has made himself implicitly righteous or ceremonially unclean by enveloping himself in the uncleanliness of his son. You might say, wow, big deal. Fair enough. But think even more. When your son comes back, perhaps with his tail between his legs, don't you want to hear what he has to say before you envelop him in this kind of embrace? Not this father. Before the son can even say, I'm sorry, he has been run to, hugged, kissed. And then he says, I've sinned against you, Father, against heaven and against you. Think about that for a minute. The Father has fully re-embraced him before he's even asked for forgiveness. This is profound. And he says, I no longer deserve to be called your son. And at this moment, everyone who's hearing the story says, true. Right? For us, this is a bit of a tearjerker, right? It's a good Hallmark movie. I don't know, whatever it is that you like to watch, you know. But in the first century world, especially to the people, if you remember from verse 1 and 2, and I know Dean pointed this out last week, that Jesus is telling these parables, Pharisees and teachers of the law, they're saying, yeah, he doesn't deserve to be called your son. That's right. What the Father does is scandalous here to the religious leaders. But instead of saying, you're right, you don't, the Father says, he calls them right, says to the servants to serve the Son. Remember, he was going to come back just as a servant. Now the servants are serving him again. He says, get the finest robe, get the ring, and get the sandals. Why those three things? Because those were the things that designated you as part of the family. Right? The servants didn't wear sandals, the family members did. The ring was a family signet that identified him as part of the family. And the robe, we know from other stories in the Old Testament, did likewise. The Father doesn't say, yeah, I guess I'll let you back in. He does everything at his disposal to show the Son that he is fully forgiven and welcome back as a son. So much so that he says, let's throw a party. Let's celebrate. It's almost as if he's caught up in the moment. Right? He says, call for the fattened calf. Now again, in the first century world of Jesus, no one did this, right? No one would kill the fattened calf and throw this kind of, this was beyond lavish. I can't even think of what that would look like in our world today, right? He's not just ordering pizza, you know? He's not even just serving up prime rib or something excessive. This is beyond excessive. And this appears to be a party for the whole village. This is a public statement of reconciliation. It is not just a quiet little dinner for a renewed family. This is radical. This is wild. And you probably already know this, don't you? But who is the Father for Jesus in this story? It's God. And who is the younger son who's run away? At some level, all of humanity. We who are created in the image of God, who find our truest identity from being part of His family, have thumbed our nose at God, said, I'm good on my own, give me what I need, let me breathe, let me live, let me have my stuff, and I'm going to go do my own thing in a foreign country outside your rule and reign. I've got this. And at some level, for many of us, we've come to the realization that story doesn't end well. And we remember who God actually is, not the characterizations we've made up about him in our mind, how he's harsh and condemning and punishing, as opposed to gracious and loving and embracing. And we're moved towards repentance and a return. This morning, I ask you, how have you been the younger son? If you cannot relate in any way to the younger son, then my guess is you have yet to fully understand the gravity of the gospel. Now, that does not mean you did exactly what the younger son did. It's meant to be bold and radical so that it's all-inclusive, right? But if you have not seen how you've thumbed your nose at God, gone your own way, said, give me what's mine, I'm going to do with it what I want, then the story of Jesus has no bearing on your life, friends. But my guess is that many of you have. And at some level, many of you are continuing to see how it plays true even today. Even if you have long since returned to the fold of God, there are still compartments of our modern compartmentalized lives, aren't they? Where we're still a younger son living, right? Well, you've got 60% of me, but this 40% over here, I'm in Egypt doing my own thing. I'm not living your culture, living your way. Give me what I need, and I'm going to go do with it what I want. This is a lifelong working out. But here's what you need to remember. That our God always welcomes back the younger son. Always looks on him or her with compassion, not condemnation. Listen to me. And always looks to celebrate his or her return, not to humiliate us upon our return. This is who God is. Don't let anyone else tell you who God is. But there's one other character in the story, yes? And if you've ever been a visitor to Hope Alliance Church before, you've gotten our gift, which is a book by Tim Keller called Prodigal God. And just read that, right? Forget everything I've said and read that, because he does even better. Unthinkable, right? But he does even better than me. At talking about the story of the prodigal son. And nearly everything I'm about to say to you is taken from his insights in this parable and how significant it is. In fact, he says it ought to be called the parable of the prodigal God. Right? Prodigal is an old word that means lavish. So we call him the prodigal son because he went and lived lavishly. But really the lavishness to be celebrated is the grace of the Father who gives lavishly back to the Son. He calls it prodigal God. I love that. Another way to categorize the parable could be the parable of the lost sons, plural. Because actually, the whole point of this parable is to isolate the older brother. Remember who they're talking to: Pharisees and teachers of the law. And Jesus, as he always does with his parables, is going to drive a little bit here. And in essence, they're saying, why is he with tax collectors and sinners all the time? Younger brothers, right? Who are the Pharisees and the teachers of the law? Older brother. Now this becomes really important for us because we spend our time in church and around religion, and it is a very easy transition for many of us to become older brothers. And it's a dangerous thing to do. Think about the older brother. He's off slaving in the fields, his words, not mine. and he hears music and dancing. And he finds out his delinquent, disobedient, rebellious brother is back, and it has caused a lavish party for the whole village that he's finding out about secondhand. How's that going to sit with you? Just be honest, right? And so he's outside the party fuming. But look again to the father. What does the father do? In the very same way the father ran out to meet the younger son, Jesus is careful to say in the parable that the father comes out to meet the older son, not wanting him to misinterpret what's happening here, but to be welcomed in to a whole village celebration. But the older son's perspective is skewed, isn't it? And his skewed perception can't allow him to see that this is a village and family celebration. Instead, it's a honoring the younger brother over me. It's a comparison game that never ends well. So why is it that the older brother is so irritated by this big celebration? Well, here is the irony of the story. What do we find out about the older brother? He's arrogant and entitled, just like the younger brother. How do we know? Hey, he didn't deserve this, but I did. And you never even gave me a young goat. Why he's asking for a goat, I don't know, right? The father's like, everything I have is yours. You've missed the whole point. The whole point is being part of the family. You've missed it. But in essence, the older brother is just as selfish and prideful as the younger brother, isn't he? Because he doesn't want the family. He wants the inheritance too. He's just after it in a different way. The younger brother was bold enough and audacious enough to say, give it to me, I'm out of here. The younger brother, right, classic first child, following the rules, crossing all the T's, dotting all the I's, proving that I'm worthy of it. But in the very same way the younger brother had missed out on the joy of being part of the family, so too the older brother had this whole time. He's miserable, even while being part of the family, having access to this all the time, and yet no joy from it. Think about this, friends. You can be right next to the Father or countries away and be just as far from the Father. That is a scary proposition. Jesus, of course, says things like this all the time. He says to some people, away from me, I never knew you. And they say, but we did all these things in your name. We served you. We honored you. We did all these things. And Jesus is like, I never knew you. You never knew me. You were never in relationship with me. We were never father and son, brother and sister. You were just doing things to get from me. This is the danger of religion. Because religion, it is not just semantic, friends. Order matters profoundly. Religion says, if you do for God, He must give to you. This is how the older brother is operating. I'm doing the things, but why am I doing them? To get. And when he doesn't get, he's furious. Ever been in that moment? But I prayed, but I asked, but I went to church. And I say this all the time, but I say it again. Keep praying and going to church and asking, right? I'm not telling you not to do those things. But are you doing them to be with God or to get from God? Two very different things. The prize, the true inheritance, is the presence of God, not the things you get from God. This brother fails to see he was invited to the very same celebration and yet said, I don't want to be part of it. How does it get to that? Profound. So where does the older brother end up? I mean, in classic Jesus fashion, the parable just comes to a halting end. doesn't it? And we're left linguistically to assume the older brother stays out. We don't know that for certain, but it's kind of hanging there like that, right? That the party is going on and the older brother's fuming on the outside looking in, feeling sorry for himself, as opposed to understanding who his father actually is. You know, one of the ways that you can know about yourself that you're in the grips of religion, not in the grips of the gospel? If you find yourself frustrated by God's grace to other people. Because internally what you're saying is, but I know I did at least as much as him. Where is it for me? Religion never leads to the experience of gospel grace. You will always be outside the feast looking in when you've been invited to the very same feast. The fattened calf was cooked up for you too. You're just thumbing your nose at God in a different way. Here's the difference, friends. Forget younger and older. If you want to understand who God is, if you want to be part of his family, it begins with the honest acknowledgement that you do not deserve to be part of his family. The younger son came to this realization, the older son never did, and therefore took everything for granted and never experienced the joy of the family, and at the end of days was on the outside looking in. Don't let that be true of you. You cannot earn your way to a seat at the feast. God graciously invites you to it. You have to receive it that way. Don't you understand? The gospel of grace is only embraced when we acknowledge the truth about our human condition. Because if you don't need grace, you will always reject it. And it's why the Pharisees and the teachers of the laws always objected to the grace of Jesus to other people, because they saw them as less than, as opposed to equal to them. It's easy to look at a tax collector and see all the wrong things he's done, right? It's easy to look at a prostitute or a sinner or whatever, and say, "Phew, geez." The difference between the sinner and the Pharisee was the sinner also recognized the gravity of what they had done and threw themselves on the grace of Jesus. And Jesus meets them with a full embrace, a look of compassion and a kiss, a robe, a signet ring, and sandals. Meanwhile, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, religious people in churches all across our country and elsewhere, are trying to dress themselves in the colors of the family of God and always frustrated when anyone else gets in. Who are you? My guess is, at some level, the older brother also is true of you. Especially if you've been hanging around the church for a while. Because the church has a subtle way of instilling in us, you can actually earn this. You can actually do enough that you can say to God, now look, I've earned my Jesus dollars and I'm cashing them in for this healing, for this job, for this thing with my family to go better. And when that transaction doesn't happen, because the gospel is not transactional, it's a gift, our faith crumbles, doesn't it? And we fume outside the celebration when we could be part of it. The gospel, friends, is not just the way to get into the family of God. It is the forever ongoing culture of the family of God. Don't let it just be the means by which you returned. Let it be the means by which you live every single day. You should wake up every day and say, I was far off, squandered, desperate to eat food of the pigs, and God welcomed me back. In fact, he was off looking for me, pursuing for me, searching for me, desirous of my return. And I live in response to it. This is who we are. This is the difference between people who receive the gospel and people instead who set the gospel aside and apply religion as a tool. Thank goodness that whether we are more younger son or more older son, our God continuously comes to us to plead with us for another way. Today, my prayer is that you would be honest with yourself about the ways in which you have distanced yourself from God. And that you would believe that He is who Jesus says He is, and return and feel His embrace. Would you pray with me? God, forgive us when we embrace a transactional attitude towards you, when we come to you because we want from you. You tell us to ask. It's not wrong to ask, but would you open our eyes to see who you are, to be desirous of a relationship with you, to throw ourselves at your feet, to feel and embrace your grace through an honesty about ourselves and who you are. God, if there are younger brothers amongst us, in whole or in part, by the power of your Spirit, might you bring us to repentance and bring us home. Thank you that you look on us with compassion, not condemnation. And God, if there are older brothers amongst us, might we see the gospel of grace for what it actually is. Not something we prove ourselves worthy of, but something that is radically bestowed on us, even though we are unworthy of it. Open our eyes to the hardness of our hearts. Convict us of the ways in which we've tried to earn your love, your affection, your action on our behalf. And soften our heart that we might come into the feast and celebrate the bounty of grace that is ours. I ask it in your name. Amen.